All right.
Right.
Welcome to the
Man.
Domestic Draft Podcast. I'm Evan Bierman here with Dan Sloak. Dan, it's a big day. It's a new dawn in the Bears world, right? I mean, we got a
Yeah.
new coach. We're going to get to it a little bit later. We got a special guest coming on, but why don't you kick it off? Let us know what you're drinking.
I have a beer here from Slow Brewing Company. That stands for San Luis Obispo, which is out here in California, in Southern
Not Sloak?
California. Not for Slowick. No, that would be sweet if I had my own brewery in time. But no, Slow Brewing. I'm drinking a blood orange hazy, but let's talk about the brewery a little bit before we get into the beer. So the San Luis Obispo Brewing Company, or Slow Brewing Company, was started in 2010. It was acquired, but in 1988 it started. But in 2010, it really kind of got the gas thrown on the fire when they started to expand operations here in Southern California. And they started to go and branch out and do some other things and not just do beer. Initially, it was a winemaker and a model that started this. And it had a good reputation for just like good handcrafted microbrews. But now it's kind of like it's like a lifestyle brand almost. So they have not only beer, but they do like the canned wine. They do their own whiskey. They got really popular right before COVID when they started to do these like Cali squeezed line of Hefeweizens, and it was just like fruit introduced to the hef, and kind of just were really easy and crushable. And that was acquired by Firestone Walker, and now they're doing like hotels, I think. They've opened up like a hotel and a brew house in San Luis Obispo, so they're kind of just like acquiring things and creating things, and really have kind of expanded since the once small handcrafted brewery that they opened up in 1988. But it's okay. It's a blood orange hazy, a slow hot IPA. It tastes a little artificial, a little bit too much Hawaiian punch squeezed into there. But if you're into that kind of thing, it's probably right up your alley. For me, it doesn't taste too much like beer and a little more juice in there. Some people love it. For me, if I'm drinking a hazy, I want to taste the hops, but I don't know. People might like it. Got 3.7 Untapped. Pretty good score. What about you, man? What are you drinking?
Yeah, I know. I feel like, we were talking about it when you were back in town too. Just we've been into the more like lighter beers, pale ales, lagers, things like that. So that one is definitely off the radar for us lately. But I've got Honker's Ale. It's kind of a classic by Goose Island. It's heavy on malt with some biscuit notes and just a hint of hops. It's one of Goose Island's flagship beers, first brewed in 1995 by Goose Island, which is one of the most well-known craft breweries in Chicago. It was initially created as a tribute to the traditional British-style bitter ales that were popular in pubs across the UK. So the name Honkers was inspired by a classic English pub that was near Goose Island at the time, their original brewery location, which was known as a honker for its lively atmosphere. So there's a little backstory on one of their flagship beers. I mean, everybody knows Goose Island. Obviously, they were acquired in 2011 by Anheuser-Busch InBev. They still try to maintain a little bit of their kind of craft brewery feel. But everybody in Chicago knows they're not the craft brewery anymore. No. There's a lot of other ones in the Chicago area. But Goose Island is a classic. This one 4.3%. And another classic for Chicago is the Chicago Sun-Times. And so we've brought on a Chicago Sun-Times sports writer, and he's also a producer of the Full Go podcast with Jason Goff, which is part of the Ringer Podcast Network. Kyle Williams, you can find him on Twitter at K_Williams Media. Kyle, thanks so much for coming on.
No, yeah, thank you guys for having me. And I love that transition, by the way. That was a great transition. But no, thank you guys for having me on. It should be a blast. I'm really looking forward to the conversation about, Chicago sports. The Bears did a thing, so it should be good.
A minor thing. We'll get to it, but first we want to know a little bit more about you. Always curious of how people get into the industry. I feel like it's such an attractive industry for a lot of people, especially former athletes, to get into. But not everybody's journey is the same. So I'm curious, how do you go from Knox College, as we were talking pre-show here, all the way up to being with the Sun-Times and the Ringer podcast, or the podcast network?
Yeah. So, since I was 13 years old, I kind of knew I wanted to pursue writing and journalism and everything. My mom bought me this, the Book of Basketball by Bill Simmons, and it was a very influential book for me. Led me to Grantland, which another one of my influences, Robert Mays. I loved his work, and
we've had him on the show.
Yeah, Robert is always the best. Like, to me, like, Simmons was always unattainable, but like Mays was a guy that I always emulated and wanted to be like. But no, then I went to Knox College. Funny enough, I went with my friend who played on the basketball team. We've been best friends since kindergarten, basically.
Mm.
And yeah, just was a part of the school newspaper there, the Knox Student. Was able to cover a little bit of everything, but I knew I wanted to get into this field. I just didn't kind of know how to go about getting my foot in the door. So I did a year at Northwestern, which was great because our campuses were in downtown Chicago for the MSJ program. So got to be around different reporters, different teams, and got to ask questions and really get embedded in the journalism scene here. And then the Sun Times was hiring for a high school writer, and I knew I wanted to get in this business. I knew I wanted to get just right and get my foot in the door. So I ended up taking it, and it's led me to covering a lot of different things I didn't expect to cover. But I've been if you ever see my byline, it's usually changing. The topic changes depending on the day. So I could be writing about basketball today, hockey tomorrow, baseball on Saturday. It's just changing, but that's kind of the backstory for me.
You got a favorite sport to cover?
Oh, basketball.
By far.
Basketball and football are those are my two go-tos. Like I just love those two. I grew up playing basketball in Chicago and everything.
Yeah, I kind of noticed that theme. I was looking through some of your past work, and it seemed like it was heavy on the basketball, but sprinkled in some Blackhawks, some Cubs stuff in there too, which Cubs stuff's great as well. Go check it out on the Sun Times website. So, was there like a first major sports story that you did that you felt like you're truly like in the game as a journalist? I mean, I'm sure just your first story with the Sun Times probably felt that way, but then was there somewhere else where you're like, oh man, I get to, write about Jed Hoyer or something, or was there like a big moment like that?
Yeah, no, yeah, I definitely, like you mentioned, the first story was one of those things. It was the Chicago Classic, which is two HBCU teams come to Chicago. Started in 1998, I believe, and so that was my very first assignment. And I had to write about the game without writing about the game. My editor didn't want a traditional gamer. He wanted me to write about like the meaning of the game, and so it really was a challenging first assignment, quite honestly. And but it proved to me I could do it. It proved to me that I could be and succeed in this field. And so, and it was my first time like seeing my name, in my byline in the paper. And so I made sure I got it framed,
Yeah.
sent it to all my professors at Northwestern, made sure to get as many copies as I could. But that's definitely a big moment. And then I would say I would say another moment that was meaningful to me was probably at spring training. I got the chance to go to spring training last year, and just the constant driving, the constant like interviewing people, talking to people. I was like, man, I'm really like doing this. I'm looking around at the reporters in the room, Megan Montemiro, Sahada
Hmm.
Sharma, like all of these different people, Paul Sullivan, a guy I grew up reading, and you just see all of these people, and you're really like, man, I'm here. And I still have those moments where I look at like who I'm with in the newsroom. I'm like, man, I'm really here. And it's just one of those moments. And then like one other moment, probably the last one that sticks out is I wrote a story. I think it was a bull story. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was a bull story. And then one of my colleagues, Rick Tellender, he sent me a text and was just like, these are two good stories. And I'm like, that's a Rick Tellender telling me that. And
Mhm.
so it's a never ending moments of like, man, this is really my job.
It's great. I know Northwestern's got a ton of alumni, especially in sports journalism. Did you have experience meeting them there, or are you in contact with some? You got any mentors, or maybe even one that's like kind of the one that you would love to work with? I think isn't Wilbon one of the big ones that's
Yep.
linked with Northwestern as well?
Yeah, Wilbon's a huge one. I'm kind of cheating with this answer because he was my professor as well, but
Yeah, I was gonna say
J
Jay Adonde, right?
yeah, Jay Adonde, he's like the director of sports media there. He was great. Like me and him, we had a relationship from before I was at Northwestern. I reached out to him when I was an undergrad at Knox College, and he gave me good advice. And he's just so invaluable, especially when we always talk about the craft of journalism and dealing with the people, the athletes that we cover, because he covered Kobe and Shaq when
Mm.
they were at their most spiteful towards each other. And so I would say J.A. Adonde is probably one of the biggest. Kevin Fishbane is awesome. I love the way he goes about doing his bear stuff. And then Andrew Golden. He covers the Nationals for the Washington Post, and
Okay.
he's just somebody who has like such a pulse on that beat. And like even through the through line through all of those reporters is that they're great reporters. They get information, they talk to people, and so I'm always trying to like emulate them and read their work. And they're all just great people too. It. I think people think JA is just this like talkative person, but he's really like a quiet person. And that was always the coolest thing to me is that like I had to go ask him questions and he would always have an answer, but he wasn't somebody who's gonna boast about what they've done. He just wanted, if you were genuinely interested, he would answer any questions you had, but he wasn't gonna just like, yeah, I did this, I did that. He really tried to make the whole experience about the student.
I got to go record an episode of PTI. I'll be right back.
So, we talked about you cover so many different kinds of sports. Is the preparation for those different from sport to sport? Like, let's say you're going to cover a high school basketball game. That's got to be a little bit different than, going to like a Cubs game or spring training or something like that. I mean, what is the difference for you?
So you would think so. I mean, the preparation for me is pretty much the same, honestly. Like now it's more like obviously, with the Cubs and the Bears, obviously I can like watch games like Bulls, Hawks, same thing. I can go back, watch games, see stuff, there's just more information available. Before a high school game, like I'll go back and see, okay, have I covered them this season? What's been written about them? What have their last 3 games looked like? Reach out to the coach. So a lot of it is a lot more legwork too, especially with a high school game, because I'm talking to people who aren't used to being interviewed. So I have to be as precise as possible. And so knowing like, okay, you were on a 2-game losing streak and you just won this game. How does this help you going into, a conference tournament? So knowing all of that stuff, because you kind of want to not lead them to an answer, but give them as much information so that they can give you the answer that you're looking for. But then when it comes to like, the 4 pro teams in Chicago, I try to keep it the same and just like, if I'm filling in for Ben Pope, who's one of our hockey guys, he is our hockey guy. And I'll just try to see what he's written recently, watch a couple of the games that they've played and just kind of try to get a gist for, what the storylines are. Like, who's on a hot streak, who's on a cold streak, what is Connor Bedard doing? You just try to really, one thing I really pride myself on is if I'm on a beat, I wanted to feel like the beat writer never took a day off, and I want the reader to get that information. So, I've done a lot of Cubs. Like I was just there for Cubs convention actually, and I always try to just pick the brain of our Cubs writer Matt Lee does a fantastic job, and you really just try. At the end of the day, you just want to make sure you know what you're writing about, and it just makes it so much easier when have the pulse of the team. Like you don't have to go back. Oh wait, did they do this? You're not stammering. You're not trying to find stuff. You just kind of know it, and then you go back and check it. Like, okay, I know when this game, this thing happened, so the quotes are going to be about this, and then it applies to a week later. It's all about just kind of knowing the team and making sure you're well abreast of like the quotes, the storylines, and really just trying to treat each beat like it's my own beat.
With like athletes being like more advocates for themselves and finding their own avenues with having their own podcasts or creating their own content, do you find that makes your job more difficult, or do you get more access to them? Are they providing more content for you to then kind of create your own piece and write your own piece on them? Or is it a roadblock because they're trying to control their own narrative?
I love athletes being in this podcasting space, honestly, because even though, our job is to talk to them and get information from them, having their own platform for them. I'm fully in favor of, Lonzo Ball has a podcast and he often talks about, Jello and just different stuff that's outside of the realm of sports, stuff that we probably aren't going to ask him. His brother had a hit song. It's not often you're going to ask about Lonzo Ball that when you were in the basketball setting, because it's for, I think people look at it as like, oh, it's basketball, it's a sport, it's an entertainment. But for those guys, it's their job. Like they eat, live, breathe that. So for him having that podcast, it was also, I remember we talked to him about it in, I believe, a couple weeks ago. And he said when he was going through his injuries, he had to start thinking about what he was going to do if he couldn't play again. And so I'm all for them having it, because at the end of the day, they're not stepping on our toes. They're not like it's just two different initiatives and what we're trying to get out of, this media landscape. Like Ian Happ, he's had a podcast, I feel, since he's been a Chicago Cub.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And he's great. Like he's just a great answer. And it's just two different realms. That's the way I look at it. I know there's always the question of, oh, they're trying to take jobs away from journalists. I just like it's two different things, two different realms. An athlete's probably gonna get a better answer from another athlete than in that type of setting than a person who didn't play probably can be. And there's pros and cons each way you look at it, but I look at it, at least from the Chicago people that do have podcasts, it's good. I'm glad that they're not just staying in that box that, oh, I'm an athlete, I just have to do athlete things. Like, no, explore podcasting. My only thing is, if they're gonna do it, give your all to it. Don't
Yeah.
just like, okay, we're gonna do it once and then come back 3 months later. Like, no, be consistent with it. Have the schedule. And credit to these guys, because it seems like they really have, took to the space and then have done it the right way.
Yeah. I see the St. Brown podcast everywhere, especially after they interviewed Caleb Williams, which we'll get to in a little bit.
Yeah.
But so I'm curious, as somebody who covers so many things, like you said, if there's any and really dives in deep on some of the, high school teams and things like that, is there any under the radar storylines or like up and coming Chicago stars that fans should keep an eye on? Chicago is always producing, athletes that go on to become really good professional players. So I'm just curious if there's anybody that you've seen play that you're like, man, this is going to be somebody to watch, years from now.
Yeah, so I have two. One is, I'm gonna go with, on the boys side, Davion Thompson. He's at Bolingbrook. He is one of the best left-handed guards I've probably since Brunson that I've seen. He's just so quick with the ball, so decisive, so mature. He has such a poise about him. And it's one of those things where, Jason always talks about how he wants his stars to be stars. He always talks about that on the Full Go. And Davion Thompson is a star. Like, when it's time for him to take over, he's getting the ball, he's going to the bucket, he's going to make something happen. So he's one person to look out for. And then another, I would say Destiny Jackson. She's a girls basketball player committed to Illinois, so she'll be in Champaign next year. And she dazzles with the ball. She can go left, right, crossover, pull up. She can hit the three. She can attack the basket. She can defend. She's really a two-way guard. And, she goes to Whitney Young. So, Whitney Young has such a high pedigree of talented guards. And so seeing her, I saw her play this year, the city championship, and she's just so dynamic. And it's not, especially at that high school level, dynamic guards are exciting. Dynamic guards are what you pay a ticket to go see. And so with those two, you're getting, your price of admission, your ticket, like the cost and value, you're getting your value's worth.
I love it.
Love a little Illinois high school basketball. I used to coach there in the south suburbs as well, Thornton. You got a favorite basketball gym in the state of Illinois that you get to go cover and kind of just be in that space? I feel like those are kind of like cathedrals for the hoops junkies, like those classic gyms. You walk in, you kind of just feel the energy.
Oh yeah, there's nothing like a great gym. I would say Bennett has a great, fantastic gym. I think Michael O'Brien, who does like high school boys on our site too. He talked about New Trier, and I think they have a new gym that's he said he called it another name. He didn't say it was a gym. He said it's like a facility. And so I got to go check out New Trier, because
sounds very New Trier-esque.
Yeah, for Mike to say that, it was like, okay, I got to go check it out. But Bennett, and then Fremd, actually. Fremd has a nice gym.
I went to Schaumburg. We played Fremd all the time.
Like I love the gyms that still feel like high school basketball gyms, because like I went to Westinghouse. I played at Westinghouse, and we were going to like Whitney Young. You go to Farragut back when Farragut was a thing, and North Lawndale. Like, my favorite memories from playing are always the ones that have like the small, intimate feel, and you really feel like, oh, this gym was meant for a high school basketball game, because now the further we get, I feel more and more gyms are starting to be more of that. Okay, we're gonna try and make this the most high tech, high, maintenance gym that we can get, which is, I get why, but there's something about those small, the basically the crowds are right next to each other. Basically, like there's just something about that field that really gets that gets me going.
Yeah, for sure.
So a couple more questions, and then we'll get to some Chicago sports stuff. But I'm curious. I'm always curious, trying to pick people's brains when they're in different career fields than me. Is there something behind the scenes, in sports journalism in general, that sports fans might not realize? Like something that that you guys are you're on the road so often, or you talked a little bit about all the prep work that goes into writing an article, but just curious if there's anything behind the scenes that you could share.
That's a great question. One thing immediately comes to mind is there's a lot of waiting. There's a lot of just kind of waiting for an athlete to be available, waiting for a manager to be available, waiting for even on the the high school side. It's still a lot of waiting, and I think people think like, oh, you guys have these such glamorous jobs, but a lot of it is really just you walking into a clubhouse as soon as clubhouse access opens. And like, I think people think like once you get the clubhouse access, like everything is just like, oh, the absolute player that you've been waiting all week to talk to is just going to be right there at his locker, unencumbered, ready to talk.
Yeah,
that doesn't happen. Like that rarely happens. So a lot of it's just waiting, and then your guy comes in, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna go talk to him, but he's on his phone, and then he goes sit down, and you're like, okay, hey, I don't mean to bother you, but can I talk to you? And he's like, oh, after the game. It's just a lot of wait. Like you waited about 30 minutes and you didn't even get him. And so a lot of it's just like just waiting. And I would say the other thing is on the road, you get the best access because they're not in their home locker room, so that they have to be in the visitors' locker room. I did a Kyle Hendricks story when they were in Washington. Just kind of talked to him about his struggles, it being at the time possibly his last year with the Cubs, and then it's something that would have been harder if they weren't at home, because when they're at Wrigley Field, they really get to hide from the media in a sense, because they know when we're going to be in there. They know where they can be, where they can hide out at. But when they're on the road, it's the best access. And all of those guys are great anyway. They even at home, most of them always talk and everything, but it's really the road where you get that access, and like those deep like feature stories that you might read most often happen on the road.
Yeah, and they could probably just book it out of there too when it's a home game, right? And just head home as quick as possible. When they're on the road, they're like, I'm just gonna go back to the hotel, whatever. I can stick around. Makes sense.
That's where my curiosity is right now, is like the dodging of the media. Like, do you know kind of the tricks in which they're trying to play, or are certain players, you don't have to name names, but like, do y'all talk and you're like, had a bad game, I bet you he's going to stay longer in the cage, or like it's a longer ice bath, we're probably not going to get access? Like, are these the things that you all are like, just call it a night, he's probably not available or she's probably not available?
So I would say I've never had that happen. Actually, a lot of the guys, if it's like a pivotal moment, the team kind of knows, and they're good about making, that. Like, I don't know if you guys remember, or big Cubs fans or whatever, but there was a Cubs game in the summer when Willie Harris had a controversial send. He sent somebody home, and it was very aggressive. Cubs were trying to win the game. Runner ended up being out. And it was the storyline, like, why did Willie Harris send this guy? And so about 3 minutes after we were done with council, Willie Harris was made available to talk and give his side of the story. And so I thought that was like a stand-up move from him to, address it. That way it's out there in the ether. And then, it's not going to be, that's the thing about baseball too. It's not going to be, if you talk, address it and everything, it's not going to be a story the next day because there's a game to play. And so luckily, I haven't had that where an obvious person of interest just didn't want to talk. We haven't had any moments, where I think it was Mark Andrews for the Ravens, the tight end who dropped that 2-point. He didn't talk before the offseason. And it's like, it's just weird to me that people do that, because it's like, if you would have caught that and you guys would have won, you would have loved to talk. But because I get the human sense of it, you don't have to talk that night, but you still should talk,
It's a bigger story not talking.
Yeah, like when you don't talk or don't address it, it just lingers and lingers. But luckily here, I've been fortunate that every time I've covered something, the person involved or the player has been willing to talk.
All right, last thing. What's next in your career? I guess what are you aspiring for, like shooting for? Is there something you're working on right now? What's next?
Like next in terms of like a story or just like career, like.
Yeah, if you got a story that you're working on, or if you're
Oh
like looking
yeah.
to break into like working on the Bears, or if there's something that you're really shooting for.
Yeah, I would love to cover the NBA. The NBA is probably the goal, I would say, is covering the NBA. That's always been a dream of mine since I was reading Simmons. Like we talked about earlier, Mays. Like I marvel at the way that he covers the NFL just so in depthly, but with just such a curiosity. Uh, is because there's always that talk in the NBA about, oh, the people who cover it don't love it, and then you look at the NFL. The NFL, it feels like every reporter just genuinely loves the sport and is curious about the sport. And so I want to bring that approach to the NBA. And then story wise, it's nothing in particular, but I'll be on Blackhawks duty on Thursday. And then I'm going to be on some Bull stuff here coming up soon. So I'm excited about that stuff.
Awesome.
All right, not about our next topic, but that's fine.
Yeah.
But we got to talk about it. It's the biggest story in Chicago right now. The Bears have hired their next head coach. It is Ben Johnson, the former offensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions. I mean, if you're like Evan and I mean, we had a group text going on all the way until this has been a vacancy of who should they pick? Is it going to be this coach, this coach? Over 20 people are being interviewed for it. What do you think about the whole process the Bears did for bringing in Ben Johnson and how quickly it happened? Were you surprised by that move? It almost seemingly felt like they were bringing in candidates the day before he was available to just make sure they met all of the standard operating procedures for that process. And then they were signing him. It was almost like they had their minds made before this process started. But I'm curious, as somebody who's on the inside, you hear what your colleagues are kind of talking about. You probably have your ear closer to the floor than we do. What do you think about this process and overall the candidate, Ben Johnson?
You mean Eddie George wasn't like a serious candidate for this job when he was interviewed just out of nowhere on Sunday morning?
So obvious.
It's
ridiculous.
It's so fun. It's so funny to me. Like I love how as soon as that happened, everyone was like, "Oh, okay," because they did the Ron Rivera interview already, but so they needed two. And it's like, oh, Eddie, Lions lose. Eddie George is in on Sunday. Huh? I wonder who the Bears want to talk to this week. But no, you know, at that initial press conference, I was a little bit nervous about Ryan Poles and who was in charge. First off, that like Kevin Warren, Ryan Poles, you never know who's truly in charge, because Kevin Warren can always say, oh, Ryan Poles is the football guy. He's going to be the point man. But you never know. Whenever you have somebody who gets inserted above the general manager who was making decisions is now all of a sudden, no, he'll be reporting to Kevin. And it's like, okay, we've seen it happen plenty of times here. And so I was a little nervous on that aspect. And then you see how just exhaustive the list was for who they wanted to interview. And I'm like, I know you want to do your homework and due diligence, but you fired Eberflus, what was it, the day after Thanksgiving? And you still had a list of however many people they had. I think it was upwards of 19. But I'm glad that for the sake of the franchise, for the sake of fans, that they got it right. Like, we obviously don't know if Ben Johnson is going to be the next Bill Walsh, the next Kyle Shanahan, but you can't fault them for this choice. When they hired Matt Eberflus, it was more of a who, and then I believe it was Dan Wiederer of the Tribune reported he was about to be fired from the Colts as their defensive coordinator. So it's one of those things where they got, for the first time seemingly in the franchise's history, the Bears got the hire right. They got the guy that everybody wanted. Ben Johnson said he wanted
was he your number
Oh
one?
yeah, he was. You drafted Caleb Williams, you need an offensive-minded guy. We see it all the time with McVay, the Shanahans, Andy Reid, and Patrick Mahomes. You need to pair your quarterback with the head coach who is going to get the best out of him. Like last year was just unacceptable. Caleb Williams having the sack numbers, and for me, the lack of interceptions is more of an indictment on the offense than it is a positive thing. Last season should have been the trial by fire for Caleb. It should have been, what can he do? What can he do? What can we build on for next season. Because right now, you can't build on anything really. And it's gonna be an interesting match to kind of see how Ben Johnson builds this offense around Caleb, similar to how he had to build the offense around Jared Goff. Because Stephen Ruiz of The Ringer, I believe he wrote this, but he said they're just two different quarterbacks. Jared Goff is more of the classic he wants to hit every in breaker known to mankind, whereas Caleb wants to, extend plays and throw it, 40 yards downfield. And so, but they got the process right. You can't fault them for getting the process right.
Yeah, and I honestly, the more I think about it, the more I like that they had that many candidates. And I think a lot of teams, they narrow it down, whether it's selecting a quarterback or bringing in a new head coach. They say we're going to just focus on these three guys and that's it. Well, maybe you should bring everybody in. Maybe you should talk to Cliff Kingsbury and pick his brain and see what he thinks about an offense. And then when you eventually have to play him, maybe you kind of know what he's thinking over there a little bit because you've talked to the guy, you understand who he is, what his offensive philosophy would have been with your quarterback. So I feel like they needed to do more of that. They didn't really do that when they drafted Caleb because they knew they were going to take Caleb, right? Maybe they should have talked to Jaden Daniels. Like, I don't know, that process, who knows? But at least with this one, I do feel like you said, it was a pretty exhaustive process. It was a good one. I think they ended up with the right guy, the guy everybody wanted clearly last year even too. So, we'll see what he's got. I'm still, and I think Dan and I have talked about this a few times too. We're both a little bit skeptical, just I think, and it's not because of Ben, at least from my perspective, Dan, it's more the Bears ineptitude to be able to, the franchise has not been able to do this, right? And they've brought in offensive minds in the past and it's not worked out. And everybody will say Matt Nagy was a completely flawed head coaching candidate, and totally he was. But and Ben's resume, like you go down this thing and it's like, this is the next stop, his head coach. But it's just, I think the Bears, track record here that is holding me back a little bit. And that's why I was like, if they end up with Mike McCarthy, like I talked myself into that over the last week. I was like, like, this guy's got a resume to fall back on. I'm totally fine with that. But I'm, in a lot of ways, I'm happy that they're taking the big swing. There's a lot more risk there, I think, than with some of the other candidates. Pete Carroll, Mike McCarthy.
Sell us on Ben Johnson, because Evan and I were both. He wasn't we had skepticism for sure, and I think it's just because we've been hurt so many times. But we also are a little fearful of the zero head coaching experience again as a head coach. And then more or less, I think like these catchphrases of like leader of men and controls the locker room type of figure. I don't think he comes to mind when you talk about that stuff in an NFL locker room. So Evan and I need to be sold on Ben Johnson. Can you do a sales pitch on him for us and other people who feel the same way?
Yeah, well, his team scored the most points in the NFL last season. So I'll start with that one.
It's a pretty good selling point.
Pretty good selling. They were one of the most efficient too, according to EPA. And
but his roster.
That's true. See, that is the fair point. It's something Jason brought up yesterday, is that you don't bring Penny Sewell with you. You don't bring Frank Ragnow with you. You don't bring Amara with you, which is a completely fair point. I think when you look at Ben Johnson, he comes from different backgrounds as well. He comes from the Air Coryell offense because he's with Adam Gase. He's, had his own offense in Detroit. He was in New Orleans. So he has the problem with, you mentioned Matt Nagy, Evan, and Matt Nagy knew one offense his entire career, the Andy Reid offense. And the problem with that pairing was he knew one offense and he wasn't flexible. And it also, they took the wrong quarterback. That's neither here nor there. But so you have a guy in Ben Johnson who comes from different backgrounds, and he's molded. The thing in Detroit that is so fascinating, he took Jared Goff, who was just thrown away. Sean McVay was like, I don't need him anymore. I don't want him anymore. Traded him while he was on the beach, basically. And he molded this offense. He got confidence into Jared Goff and turned him around, his career around. And so, the Bears don't have the offensive line that the Lions do, but you have to, I feel like that's more of a, do you have faith in Ryan Poles to get the offensive line right? But from the Ben Johnson standpoint, he's going to give confidence to Caleb. Caleb has talked about how he wants the next head coach to be someone he can build with for the next 17, 18 years. And with Ben Johnson, you have a guy who not only does it seem like he gets to connect with players and find out their strengths, but he's also going to mold their offense to each of the guys' strengths, which, you're not going to have Keenan Allen running go routes last year while Roma Dunze's breaking over, shallow crosses and everything. Like, no, he's going to use DJ Moore, Roma Dunze. He's going to find out what the strength of this team is and lean into it. And he's not afraid to run the football. This is Chicago. We love running the football, right? He is going to run the football. He did it with Montgomery, another guy the Bears kind of toss away, Montgomery, and Jahmyr Gibbs, the dynamic duo and he really leaned into it. So I think the first selling point is he's going to score a lot of points. I mean, he has the history of doing so when things are fully operational. But before that, it goes into his ability to connect with his quarterback, connect with the skill receivers. And, when you run into these offensive masterminds, all of it's like, oh, the trick plays. Oh, but he wants to run the football. Even in their playoff loss, I didn't agree with the decision to have Jameson throw the ball. But,
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't lose that. I mean, they had 31 points. They just couldn't stop Jaden Daniels in that offense. And when you look around the league at all the best head coach, offensive head coach, quarterback pairings, they all get the best out of their quarterback. And I think with Ben Johnson, you have that unique opportunity to have that in Chicago for the first time.
And it's crazy. I think the contract, at least what I've seen, the reports have been around $13 million per year, which would make him definitely top 10. I think higher than John Harbaugh is making in Baltimore, if I'm not mistaken, and just behind Kyle Shanahan, I believe. So, I mean, that's where he's at contract wise, which I think is wild for the Bears to do something like that. That's totally out of the Bears, wheelhouse to hand over a bag, like you said, to, a first time head coach. So I guess my only concern still is just who's the adult in the room at this point. You got Poles is under 40 and only been doing this for a little bit. And this is his first time as a head coach. And then Caleb Williams is going to be in his second year. So GM, head coach, quarterback, all very inexperienced. And then Kevin Warren, I don't know if there's anybody that really trusts too much of what he's got going on. He's focused on the stadium and stuff too. So I've seen the defensive coordinator position. Has been talked about a little bit. Dennis Allen as a strong possibility. I don't think that's been signed on the dotted line yet, but what do you think about him? And does his previous head coaching experience kind of make up for that inexperience that Ben Johnson's bringing?
Yeah. So, when Sean McVay first got to LA, I believe his first defensive coordinator was Wade Phillips. And you kind of see these younger offensive coordinator guys go get those grizzled veteran defensive coordinators who've also been head coaches. I mean, Mike McDaniel did with Vic Fangio when he was in Miami. And the Dennis Allen thing is, I mean, it would allow the Bears to kind of stay in their 4-down front, which is, I think, probably important to Ryan Poles as he's giving out contracts to, Tremaine Edmonds to be the middle linebacker. And you have to figure out the other edge rusher, bro. You have Montez Sweat. But I think the experience is key. You need experience. The problem with the offensive coaching staff to me last year was that it wasn't cohesive, even on both sides, even the defensive side. It didn't seem to be a sense of cohesion. It just seems like something was off from the jump, whether it was Waldron's communication skills, whether it was Eric Washington's communication skills, just something didn't seem right. And so I'll be curious to see what they can do with Dennis Allen in terms of like, who does he hire as position coaches? Because so much of the NFL is the position coaches and the guys underneath the coordinators. Because let's just say next year things go right for the defense and the unit bounces back, and Dennis Allen gets another head coaching opportunity. How do you replace him? Is there a ready-made person in-house? How well of a teacher was he to, his second in command, his third in command? And so I like the move because, like you mentioned, Ben Johnson hasn't been a head coach before. He hasn't been in this profession long. And so you need somebody in the room who he can talk to, he can bounce ideas off of. And the Dennis. I mean, because most Bears fans are running like, oh, he got fired in New Orleans. They were a dumpster fire. But 2 years ago, that defense was legit. When those players, Lattimore, when like Demario Davis, when those guys were healthy and right, they were a strong unit, a strong competitive unit. And so I really think he could teach defense when that's just his sole unit. My only concern is he probably wants to be a head coach again. So then now how do you prepare? It's kind of like what the Bears have been dealing with if they would have had a defensive minded head coach and had a great OC. Okay, if he leaves, then how do you replace him? But you just need experience. And I think Dennis Allen, if he gets the job, I know nothing's been confirmed. We'll probably learn more after Johnson's opening presser, but that would be a good first signing for him, is to get a guy who knows what it takes to be a head coach in the NFL.
Are you hearing any names on the offensive side that he's looking to add to his staff?
No, I haven't. It's been very tight-lipped since he got to Chicago. I'm sure you guys probably saw that video of him giving the speech at Hallis Hall to the staff workers and everything.
Yep.
How out of the ordinary is that too? Was that
like
pretty?
I've
something I've never seen before. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen a team in-house video where the head coach is giving a pep talk right away to, I don't think it's a good thing or a bad thing. It just was unusual. I was like, oh, okay, this is the first time I've, heard Ben Johnson speak since the announcement was made. But, haven't heard anything on the offensive side. I'm curious to see who he brings along from Detroit. Yeah, I know there's talks about him bringing his O-line coach with him. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but whoever the O-line coach was in Detroit, I know he's highly regarded, and he'd be a tough get.
The receivers coach is Antoine Randall as well, who's a Chicago native, and they're like maybe he brings him over back home and everything. But that's all I've heard as well, is the poaching of Detroit.
The problem is I'm not sure how let's say excited Dan Campbell is going to be to let assistants go, because he's losing both coordinators. So that's not a easy task to replace either one of those guys. So I'm not sure how exactly eager he's going to be to approve of, okay, you could take like 3 guys with you, because like I've learned over the past year, like just through reading, through talking to people, head coaches don't love to give assistants or let guys who get jobs in other places then take from people,
especially in the division.
Yeah. And so it's gonna be interesting. It's gonna be tricky, because Kyle Shanahan famously always wanted Mike McDaniel with him. At every stop, he always wanted McDaniel to be with him. So I'm curious to see like who Ben Johnson can bring, especially because Aaron Glenn's also gonna be a head coach somewhere most likely. So it's like, I wonder if they've talked about who can go with who, because sometimes Ben Johnson might want a guy on the defensive side to bring with him. You like all of these, it's all relationships, and you never truly know who these guys have the strongest of relationships with.
Yeah. And I think just before we got on here, I was reading that Aaron Glenn had an offer on the table from the Jets. So it sounds like he's probably going to be gone, like you said. So the bar was set way too high last season, going into, watching Hard Knocks. But what should Bears fans expect this season? What should our expectations be going into the upcoming season now? Should we set it a little bit lower, 9 wins? We just want an improvement. Are we thinking playoffs right away? What do you think?
Should be.
Before we hopped on, I saw somebody, I think it was FS1. They said, it's playoffs or bust for Caleb Williams and Ben Johnson now. And I kind of smiled, because I mean, how many games did the Bears win this season? 5, I believe it was, because they won 4 before London and then the last Packers game. But so, in a normal sense, I'd be like, okay, playoffs.
10-game losing streak, right? So
yeah, like 10-game losing streak. But given how they ended the season, and just it's hard to see 5 wins to, you probably need 9 or 10 to get to the playoffs. That's a big jump. Like, I don't think people understand just how big, like going from 5 to 9 wins would be a big jump.
It was like Commanders this year, right?
Like the Commanders, everything went right. All of their moves on the margins just worked. Getting Kingsbury, all of it worked. and that's how they were able to have this run. But you don't usually see big jumps like that. I would say expectations, you should aim to be competitive. You should aim to be competitive, and you should aim to. It's all about Caleb Williams. Like, it's his world. We're all just paying rent, and his development and how he looks with Ben Johnson. That's what every fan should take away from this year is, what does number 18 look like? How confident does he look? How far away is he? How is he closer to Jaden Daniels than we thought because of what he was playing with last year and around last year? So it's just one of those things where playoffs would be great, but it's also year one of a guy who's never been a head coach before. So they're in this weird area where there's a plan in place, but they have veteran guys. Sweat's not getting any younger. Tremaine is a lot younger than I always think, and then I look up his age. I'm like, man, how is he still like 27? And he was in the 2018 draft. But time is not ticking. But in the NFL, your window closes a lot faster than people probably think. But you just signed DJ Moore, Jalen Johnson, and those guys to extensions. You still want to strike while you have Caleb on that rookie contract, but the next step is just seeing improvement. Last year was unacceptable from the franchise. 10-game losing streak. Things never truly looked right, to be honest, except for spurts or games here and there, and then it would always be undone because of coaching malpractice. But it should just be about getting back to respectability.
Yeah. 100%. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Again, he's Kyle Williams. You can find him on Twitter at @K_Williams Media. He's a Chicago Sun-Times sports writer. Check out his articles. And he's a producer of the Full Go podcast with Jason Goff. Again, that's part of the Ringer Podcast Network. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts. Kyle, thanks so much for joining us.
No, thanks you guys for having me on. It was a blast.
Appreciate it, Kyle. All right. Thanks to our guest again. It was Kyle Williams. You could find him on X, formerly Twitter, at K_Williams Media. Great guest. Wish we could have talked a little more Bulls. I wish that team was a little more exciting. He definitely has the basketball background. But Evan, I got a question for you.
All right.
What Chicago Bull will be present at the All-Star game this year for the NBA?
I mean, if you're asking me, I would say none of them deserve that. But go ahead, hit me. Who is it?
None of them will probably be playing in the game, but there will be a Bull participating in the events. It's Matas Buzelis, the rookie, the top, 11 pick in the draft. He's going to be in the dunk contest, man. Are you excited about that?
I think so. And I've kind of been noticing that as a trend, right? It's like the younger, scrappy, draft picks. Obi Toppin was in there like a couple years back when he was drafted.
Or you want the stars?
I think they're trying to highlight the young players and get some hype around them. I want the stars. I mean, who doesn't want to see the stars in there though? But I think it'll be fun to see a Bull in the dunk contest. Don't you think?
Maybe. I want to see the stars. I think what they need to do is start making some of this stuff mandatory, man. If you play X amount of minutes, you're going to be in the dunk contest. If fans vote you in, you're doing it. You got to play X amount of games to get 100% of your I don't know. NBA, to me, like, this is the season. I still watch a lot of the Bulls games, but I think this is the season I've watched the least amount of Bulls games.
That's 100%. I mean, players are not playing as many games as they used to, but I don't know. That's for another day. Thanks again to our guest, Kyle Williams, for joining us today. For Dan Slowick, I'm Evan Bierman. You've been listening to the Domestic Draft Podcast. If you're listening on Spotify, don't forget to rate the show. You can find us on Twitter at Domestic Draft, on Instagram at Domestic Draft Podcast. Our website is domesticdraft.com, and you can watch the show on YouTube. Just search up Domestic Draft and drop us a sub. Thanks again for listening. Cheers.
Cheers.